The Atlantic didn't care about your nationality. It didn't care about your pride. It only cared about who could survive its freezing embrace. And in 1942, that embrace was tightening around Britain's throat. They called it the happy time. Those German U-boat commanders, laughing as they watched merchant ships burn against the night horizon. Britain was starving. Convoys were being slaughtered. And in the mahogany-paneled offices of the Admiralty, one man stood before a map dotted with sinking ships and made a decision that would change everything. Or so he thought. Admiral Sir Max Horton had seen it all. Jutland. The Great War. He'd watched the Royal Navy rule the waves with the arrogance of centuries. So when the Canadians showed up with their little fleet of corvettes, those flower-named ships that looked more suited for a yacht club than a war zone, he couldn't help himself. "A toy fleet," he muttered during the briefing, just loud enough for the room to hear. Bloody colonial yachtsmen playing at sailor. The Canadian officers in the back stiffened. Their corvettes were small, yes, cramped. Built for coastal patrol, not the murderous North Atlantic. They rolled in heavy seas like drunken barrels. Their sonar was outdated. Their crews were farm boys and fishermen's sons from Nova Scotia and British Columbia, kids who'd never seen a U-boat in their lives. But they were all Britain had left. Horton's words spread through the fleet like a virus. Toy fleet. The Royal Navy's elite turned their backs in the officers' mess. British captains refused to share intelligence. Canadian ships were given the worst assignments. Rear guard, the place where stragglers got picked off by waiting wolves. They were cannon fodder with a maple leaf. But here's what Horton didn't know. While he was dismissing those corvettes, a different kind of war was being fought in a converted warehouse in Liverpool. No brass bands. No medals. Just a wooden floor painted with grid lines and a group of young women in WRNS uniforms moving tiny ship models with pool cues. Commander Gilbert Roberts had been given an impossible task: figure out why the U-boats were winning. Every convoy that left New York or Halifax was being torn apart. The Germans had developed something called the Wolf Pack. Not one submarine but dozens coordinating attacks like a pack of killer whales herding seals. They'd strike at night on the surface, using the darkness as their cloak. By the time escort ships knew what was happening, 3 or 4 merchantmen would be burning, and the U-boats would have vanished. Roberts was a wargamer. Not the kind who played with toy soldiers in his mother's basement, but a tactical genius who understood that war was just mathematics with violence. He'd been shunted aside before the war, considered eccentric for his belief that games could predict real battles. Now, with Britain losing a ship every 4 hours, eccentricity looked like salvation. His team was unconventional. The Women's Royal Naval Service, Wrens they called them. Girls barely out of school. Jean Laidlaw, a mathematician from Cambridge who could calculate torpedo trajectories in her head. Betty, whose father was a fisherman and understood currents better than any admiral. They worked in a room with blackout curtains, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of chalk. On the floor they recreated the Atlantic in miniature. Each ship was a wooden model. Each U-boat a sliver of painted balsa. They played out attack after attack, night after night, until their eyes burned and their hands cramped. What they discovered would make Horton's insults taste like ash. The U-boats weren't attacking randomly. They were predictable. Mathematical. They'd infiltrate the convoy from the rear on the surface, using their diesel engines to outrun the slow merchant ships. They'd fire at close range, point blank practically, then dive deep and slip away while escorts chased ghosts. It was a pattern. And patterns could be broken. Roberts and his Wrens developed something called the beta search. It was counterintuitive. When a U-boat attacked, you didn't chase it. You turned into the convoy, creating a barrier of ships between the wolves and their prey. You used star shells, massive flares that turn night into artificial day, to expose the surface submarines. You dropped depth charges not where the U-boat was, but where mathematics said it would be. It was brilliant. It was elegant. And it was being taught to those toy fleet Canadians that Horton had dismissed. Because here's the thing about being underestimated, it makes you hungry. Those Canadian crews, those farm boys and fishermen's sons, had been training in secret. While the Royal Navy's old guard clung to their traditions, the Canadians were learning Roberts' wargame tactics. They practiced turning drills until their ships groaned. They fired star shells until they could do it blindfolded. They turned their corvettes, those rolling, pitching little flowers, into precision instruments. HMCS Sackville. HMCS Oakville. HMCS Wetaskiwin. Names that meant nothing to the British elite. Ships that could turn inside their own length. Crews that could go from sleep to battle stations in 90 seconds. They'd been assigned to convoy SC-118, A slow procession of 37 merchant ships lumbering from Halifax to Liverpool. It was a death sentence convoy, the kind the Admiralty wrote off before it even left harbor. The Wolfpack was waiting. U-262, U-614, U-438, U-609. 12 submarines in total, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Siegfried Strelo, a killer with 23 ships already to his credit. They'd been tracking SC-118 for 3 days, shadowing it like sharks waiting for the seal to tire. Strelo had done this a dozen times. He knew the British escorts would chase the first torpedo flash, leaving the convoy exposed. He knew they'd drop depth charges randomly, wasting ammunition on empty ocean. He knew they'd fail. What he didn't know was that the Canadian Escort Group commander, Lieutenant Commander John Stubbs, had spent 6 weeks in Liverpool with Robert's Wrens. He'd walked the wooden floor. He'd moved the tiny ships. He'd lost the wargame 23 times before he won once. And he'd learned. The attack came at 0217 hours, February 4, 1943. A single torpedo fired from U-262 at the rear of the convoy. The tanker SS Robert W. Pomeroy exploded in a fireball that lit the sky for 20 miles. The British escort HMS Dianthus did exactly what Strelo expected. She turned hard to port, racing toward the torpedo track, her astic pinging wildly. But the Canadians? They turned into the convoy. HMCS Sackville, that toy corvette, swung her bow toward the heart of the merchant ships. Her captain, Lieutenant Alan Easton, wasn't looking for the U-boat that fired. He was looking for the ones that hadn't fired yet. Star shells arced into the sky. Dozens of them fired not just from Sackville but from Oakville and Wetaskiwin, creating a dome of light over the convoy. And there they were. 3 U-boats surfaced, their conning towers silhouetted against the burning tanker, caught in the act of maneuvering for their own shots. They'd expected darkness. They'd expected confusion. They'd expected amateurs. What they got was a firing squad. Sackville's 4-inch gun barked first, the shell screaming across the water and exploding against U-614's conning tower. The submarine shuddered, its pressure hull breached, and it began to settle by the bow. Oakville's depth charges rolled off her stern, not in a random pattern but in a precise mathematical spread, exactly where Betty the fisherman's daughter had calculated a diving U-boat would be. The explosions lifted U-438 out of the water like a breaching whale, her hull cracking like an eggshell. The Wolfpack scattered. But they couldn't escape. The Canadians had formed a screen between the U-boats and the open ocean, herding them back into the kill zone. For 2 hours the Atlantic became a slaughterhouse. Depth charges detonated in rhythmic sequences. Star shells burned holes in the night. And one by one the U-boats died. U-609 tried to run on the surface, her diesel screaming. Sackville's gunners walked shells across her deck, blowing the 88mm gun mount into the sea. The submarine rolled over, her propellers still turning, and vanished. U-262, Strelo's own boat, dove deep, thinking the cold black water would hide her. But Wetaskiwin's sonar operators, those farm boys, had been trained to listen not for the submarine, but for the silence where a submarine should be. They heard it, the void, the acoustic hole that meant a hull was blocking the natural sea noise. Depth charges dropped. Not randomly. Precisely. The explosions crushed U-262 like a tin can. By dawn, 7 U-boats littered the seafloor beneath convoy SC-118. 7. In one night. The Canadians had lost 1 tanker. The Wolfpack had lost more than half its strength. The signals flashed back to Liverpool. To the Admiralty. To Horton's desk. He read the report once. Then again. Then he walked to the window overlooking the Mersey and watched the destroyers coming in from patrol. He didn't say a word. But that evening in the officers' mess, he raised his glass to a Canadian officer for the first time in his life. Word spread. Not through official channels, those were still clogged with British bureaucracy, but through the wireless chatter of ships at sea. The Canadians had a trick. A method. A way of killing U-boats that actually worked. Robert's beta search was being refined, improved, adapted. The Wrens in Liverpool added new variables. Water temperature layers that bent sonar waves, the exact speed a corvette could turn without losing her escort position. The psychological pressure on a U-boat commander who just watched his packmates die. The Germans were confused. Their intelligence reported the same small Canadian ships they'd always faced. But now those ships were lethal. Convoy after convoy slipped through what should have been killing zones. Wolf packs that had operated with impunity were being decimated. The happy time was over. Captain Lieutenant Strelo, floating in a life raft with 3 other survivors from U-262, was picked up by HMCS Oakville. As he was hauled aboard, shivering and oil-soaked, he looked at the Canadian sailors around him. "Boys. Just boys." He asked in broken English. "How? How you know?" A young seaman, barely 19, handed him a blanket. "We played the game, sir. We played it 1,000 times. The game. The war game. The wooden floor in Liverpool. The tiny ships moved by girls with pool cues. That was the secret weapon. Not a new torpedo. Not a secret radar. Just mathematics. Pattern recognition. The willingness to admit you didn't know everything and to learn from defeat." By March 1943, the Canadian escort groups had become the most feared anti-submarine force in the Atlantic. They'd sunk 23 U-boats in 6 weeks. The Admiralty, in a classified report, noted that Canadian-led escort groups were 3 times more effective than British groups of comparable size. Horton read that report and requested a transfer to Liverpool. He wanted to see this war game for himself. Roberts met him at the door of the converted warehouse. No salute. Just a nod. "Welcome to the toy factory, Admiral." The floor was covered in chalk lines. The Wrens were moving ships. Horton watched as Jean Laidlaw demonstrated the beta search, her hands moving the models with the precision of a concert pianist. He saw the mathematics, the geometry, the brutal logic of it, and he understood. "You're corvettes," he said quietly. "They're not toys." "No," Roberts agreed. "They're scalpels. In the hands of surgeons." That summer the Atlantic turned. The Germans lost 41 U-boats in May alone. Dönitz, the architect of the Wolfpack strategy, pulled his remaining submarines from the North Atlantic. They'd lost. Not to battleships. Not to aircraft carriers. To a bunch of kids in corvettes and a room full of women playing war games. The Canadian Navy, that toy fleet, had escorted 25,343 merchant ships across the Atlantic. They'd lost 1,797 sailors. They'd sunk, damaged, or participated in the destruction of 33 U-boats in the critical period of 1943. But more importantly, they'd proven that innovation beats tradition. That the underdog, when given the right tools and the right training, becomes the apex predator. After the war, the records were sealed. The Wrens were disbanded, sent home to become wives and mothers. Roberts was given a quiet retirement. The Canadians went back to their farms and fishing boats. The Admiralty wrote the official histories, and somehow the story of the toy fleet and the wargame girls got lost in the footnotes. The Atlantic remembers what history forgot. But memory is a cruel thing. It preserves the steel and forgets the flesh. The corvettes came home to quiet harbors, their flower names eventually painted over for civilian trade. HMCS Sackville became a research vessel, then a museum piece tied to a Halifax dock, her 4-inch gun now just a prop for tourists. The men who served on her scattered like seeds on the wind. Lieutenant Alan Easton, Sackville's captain during that February slaughter, returned to his family's farm in Saskatchewan. He married his childhood sweetheart, had 3 children, and never spoke of the war. Not once. His son would later find a shoebox in the attic filled with medals. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Atlantic Star, a citation signed by King George VI, and letters from families of merchant sailors whose lives he'd saved. Easton had kept them, but he'd never shown them. When asked why years later, he just tapped his temple. "The ocean's still in here. Don't need to let it out." Jean Laidlaw, that Cambridge mathematician who'd calculated death for U-boats, became a schoolteacher in Edinburgh. She taught algebra to generations of children who never knew their quiet Miss Laidlaw had once held the lives of thousands in her equations. She never married. Her former Wrens would occasionally visit, and they'd sit in her small flat drinking tea, not talking about the warehouse floor or the wooden ships. They didn't need to. The chalk dust was in their bones. Betty, the fisherman's daughter who understood currents, returned to her father's boat in Cornwall. She took over the family business when he died, running trawlers that brought up cod and haddock instead of German submarines. The local fishermen respected her. She could read the sea like a book, but they never knew she'd written a chapter of naval history. She died in 1982, cremated, her ashes scattered in the same waters where she'd helped sink U-438. The Germans had their own ghosts. Strello spent the remainder of the war in a Canadian POW camp in Alberta, where he learned English by reading farming manuals and mechanics journals. He became a translator after the war, working for a shipping company in Hamburg. In his desk drawer he kept a small photograph, cracked, water-stained, showing him and his U-boat crew in happier times. On the back he'd written, "We were wolves. They taught us to be sheep." He never blamed the Canadians. He blamed the arrogance of Dönitz and the High Command, who'd believed the Wolfpack was invincible. Admiral Horton retired in 1945, his health broken by years of stress. In his memoirs published posthumously, he devoted exactly 3 paragraphs to the Canadian Navy. He mentioned their unexpected competence and admirable tenacity. He never wrote about calling them a toy fleet. He never apologized. Some sins, perhaps, are too heavy for words. Roberts, the wargamer, was knighted for his contributions. Sir William Gilbert Roberts, they called him. He gave speeches at military colleges, wrote papers on tactical theory, and watched as his beta search was adopted by navies around the world. But he always felt like a fraud. The real heroes, he insisted, were the Wrens. The Canadians. The boys who died while he moved wooden ships in a safe warehouse. He turned down invitations to Remembrance Day ceremonies, saying, "I remember them every day. I don't need a parade." The numbers were staggering. The Canadian Navy started the war with 6 destroyers and a handful of coastal vessels. By 1945, they'd built or acquired 471 warships. They'd escorted 25,343 ships across the Atlantic. They'd lost 24 warships and 1,797 sailors. And they'd participated in the sinking of 33 U-boats in those critical months of 1943 alone. But numbers are just tombstones without stories. The real story was in the small things. The way a stoker from Vancouver learned to coax every last revolution from ancient engines built in Glasgow. How a signalman from Newfoundland could read Morse code through static that sounded like screaming demons. The way a cook from Winnipeg could stretch rations for weeks without complaint, because his mother had taught him during the Depression that hunger was just another enemy to be defeated. The war ended and the world moved on. The Cold War began. Jets replaced propellers. Missiles replaced torpedoes. The wooden floor in Liverpool was torn up, the warehouse converted into a furniture store. The Wren's records were archived, then lost in a fire in the 1960s. Jean Laidlaw's chalkboard equations, those beautiful proofs of death and survival, became ash. But the Atlantic kept the secret. The seabed became a cemetery. U-262, U-438, U-609, U-614. They rest there still, their hulls slowly rusting into the continental shelf. Marine life colonized them. Anemones grew in conning towers. Fish nested in torpedo tubes. The violence was absorbed as the ocean absorbs everything. In 1985, a team of oceanographers mapping the sea floor off Newfoundland found something unusual. 7 submarine hulls within a 10-mile radius, all from the same time period. The discovery made a brief splash in academic journals, then vanished. No one connected it to convoy SC-118. No one remembered the toy fleet. But the Atlantic remembers. Every winter, when the storms howl down from the Arctic and the waves rear up like white-maned horses, you can still hear it if you listen. Not with your ears but with something older. The groan of strained steel. The whisper of escaping air bubbles. The silence where a hull should be. The ocean sings the song of those who never came home, Canadian and German alike. The Veterans Affairs Office in Ottawa has a wall of photographs. Young men in uniform, their faces smooth, their eyes already old. Beside each photo, a small plaque. Name. Rank. Ship. Date of death. The visitors who come are mostly grandchildren now, running fingers over names they never knew, hearing stories their own parents were too broken to tell. One photograph shows a boy named Michael O'Leary, 18 years old, from a fishing village in Nova Scotia. He'd lied about his age to join up. Served on HMCS Drumheller. Died when a U-boat's torpedo struck the engine room. The photo is black and white, but his eyes are the color of the Atlantic on a clear day. His great-granddaughter visits every Remembrance Day. She brings a single white rose and places it beneath his picture. She doesn't know why, but she feels closer to him there than at his actual grave, which is just a name on a monument in Halifax because his body went down with his ship. The Germans have their own walls. The U-boat memorial at Moltenort, near Kiel, lists the names of every submariner lost. 30,000 names. Carved in stone, cold and permanent. Among them, Strello's crew. The families who visit feel the same ache, the same question. Was it worth it? The answer, like the ocean, is deep and dark and offers no comfort. In 2003, a Canadian documentary crew tried to piece together the story of SC-118. They tracked down the last surviving member of Sackville's crew, a 92-year-old named Frank Mitchell, living in a nursing home in Victoria. He was blind, his hands trembling, but his memory was a steel trap. He described the night of February 4th in perfect detail. The smell of the burning tanker, the sound of the 4-inch gun, the way the deck plates jumped under his feet when the depth charges detonated. The interviewer asked him what he was most proud of. He didn't hesitate. We were kids. Just kids. And we saved them all. Every damn ship except that tanker. We saved them. Then he started to cry, silent tears running down his wrinkled cheeks. But we lost Jimmy. And Tom. And that kid from Winnipeg whose name I can't remember. They didn't get to be old men in nursing homes. That's the real legacy of the toy fleet. Not the medals or the statistics or the tactical innovations. It's the empty chairs at family dinners. The unmarried sweethearts. The children who grew up without fathers. The veterans who came home but never really left the Atlantic. The Royal Canadian Navy's official motto is, "Ready, aye ready." It's a fine sentiment, but the truth is more brutal. They were ready because they had to be. Because Britain was starving. Because Horton's insults lit a fire. Because those Wrens in Liverpool refused to let mathematics be just numbers on a page. Today if you visit Halifax you can tour HMCS Sackville. She's the last of the Flower-class corvettes, birthed as a museum ship. Kids run across her decks, playing soldier, while their parents read the placards about the Battle of the Atlantic. The 4-inch gun is still there, preserved in black paint. The depth charge racks are empty. The sonar room is a cramped closet with a fake display. But stand on her bow on a foggy morning. Feel the deck move with the harbor swell. Listen to the steel groan and the halyards slap against the mast. Close your eyes. You can almost hear it. The star shells bursting. The depth charges falling. The desperate voices on the wireless, calling for help that finally arrived. The toy fleet didn't just win a battle. They proved that arrogance is the deadliest weapon in any arsenal. That the established order, the revered institutions, the way things have always been done, these are the real enemies. The Canadians, the Wrens, the dismissed and the underestimated, they taught the world that victory goes to those who adapt, who learn, who refuse to accept their own limitations. And they taught us something else, something harder to swallow, that every innovation in war, every brilliant tactic that saves lives, is built on a foundation of death. The beta search worked because Roberts and his team had analyzed hundreds of failed convoys. Hundreds of sinkings. Hundreds of funerals. Their mathematical precision was purchased with the blood of those who died learning what not to do. Horton's insult, toy fleet, became a gift. It galvanized those sailors, gave them a chip on their shoulder, a reason to prove him wrong. But how many other insults, dismissals and prejudices have cost us victories? How many innovators have we ignored because they didn't fit the mold? How many Wrens have we sent home to quiet lives because we couldn't stomach the idea that girls with chalk could outthink admirals with decades of experience? The Atlantic doesn't care about your pride. It cares about who survives. And survival, in the end, is the only metric that matters. We remember the big names, Montgomery, Patton, Eisenhower. We build statues and name highways after them. But the real war was fought by boys in corvettes and girls in WRNS uniforms. By fishermen's sons who understood currents and mathematicians who saw patterns in chaos. By stokers and signalmen and cooks who kept the machines running, the messages flowing, the bodies fed. The toy fleet didn't just save Britain. They saved the idea that merit matters more than pedigree. That innovation beats tradition. That the dismissed and the underestimated can become legends. And they left us with a question hanging in the salt air like fog. Who are we dismissing today? Whose innovation are we ignoring because it doesn't come from the expected places? Which toy fleet is out there right now ready to prove us wrong? The Atlantic remembers. The question is, will we?